There is no time in the realm of brass and blood. There is no logic, save for the logic of the blade. There is only the eternal screaming moment of the kill, repeated ad infinitum across landscapes of bone and rivers of gore. Upon the skull throne, the Lord of Rage sits, ever watchful, ever hungry. His gaze is the pressure of 1,000 suns, and his thoughts are the grinding of tectonic plates. For an age, that gaze had swept across the sea of souls, watching his legions wage the great game against the puppets of the corpse god's fallen sons and the trickster creations of his hated brothers. It was a war without end, a slaughter without purpose beyond its own existence. It was magnificent, but it was unchanging. And the Lord of Khorne desired more. He desired not just to taste the Materium's blood, but to make it bleed forever. Deep within the magma canyons of his domain, where the sky wept boiling blood, a conclave of 8 of his greatest servants knelt before a mountain of skulls that stretched into the crimson cloud. These were the Exalted Bloodthirsters, the Unbound, each a walking apocalypse, a general of demonic legions whose names were curses on 1,000,000 worlds. At their forefront was Kajaga Thrax, the Gore Shepherd, first of the 8. His hide was the color of cooling iron, his wings vast, blackened shrouds that had eclipsed suns. His horns were a crown of jagged obsidian, and in his grip was the great axe World Ender, a weapon that had tasted the hearts of primarchs and the cores of planets. He did not kneel in supplication, but in anticipation, his entire being a coiled spring of immense patient violence. It was to Kajagathrax that the vision came. It was not a whisper, not a dream, but a brand of pure, divine rage, seared directly onto his soul. The skull throne itself seemed to lean forward across infinity, and the universe screamed. Kajagathrax saw a tapestry of stars, a spiral arm of the mortal galaxy glittering with the cold, arrogant light of trillions of souls who lived in blissful ignorance of the powers that governed their meaningless existence. He saw the star map not as a place, but as a canvas. A colossal 8-pointed rune of brass and fire was superimposed over it, a symbol of rage so potent it made reality itself recoil. The rune was a promise, a prophecy, a command. Each point, each line, each vertex was a designated cluster of stars, a specific system, a world that must be offered up not in conquest, but in absolute annihilation. This was not to be a war for territory or for the reaping of skulls, though there would be skulls beyond counting. This was to be a ritual of galactic proportions. The Blood-Sworn Crusade would not claim the veiled arm. It would murder it, and in its death, transform it into a permanent, weeping wound in the Materium, from which the energies of Khorne could pour forth for all eternity. The vision receded, leaving behind an after-image of burning purpose that dwarfed any ambition Kajagathrax had ever known. The other 7 Bloodthirsters saw the reflection of the Blood God's will in the Gore Shepherd's blazing eyes. There was no discussion, there was no debate, there was only acceptance, a roar of 8 cataclysmic voices that shook the foundations of the Skull Lands and sent avalanches of bone cascading down the mountainsides. This was the will of Khorne. This was the ultimate act of worship. The gathering began. From the brass citadel, the command was issued, a psychic bellow of pure rage that echoed through every corner of Khorne's domain. It was a summons that could not be ignored. Legions of bloodletters, their hellblades already dripping with ethereal gore from endless battles, ceased their internecine warfare and turned their horned heads as one. They formed into ranks that stretched from horizon to horizon, their chittering chants coalescing into a single deafening paean to war. From the pits of battle, flesh hounds with collars of burning brass strained at their leashes, their multi-dimensional senses already catching the scent of future prey worlds away. Juggernauts, monstrous amalgamations of daemonic fury and living metal, stamped their hooves, shaking the very ground of the realm as skull cannons were dragged from their armories, their barrels still hot from firing the damned souls of Slaaneshi champions. The 8 Bloodthirsters became the fulcrum of this impossible mobilization. They were the Octavius Carnage, the anointed leaders of the Blood-Sworn Crusade. Kajagathrax, the Gore Shepherd, would lead. Andrath the Unbound, his eternal rival, would command the vanguard. The other, Scarebrand the Exile, though not present, his rage was a beacon they would follow. Kyrus the Eight-Bladed, Umbrakhair the Skulltaker, and 4 more whose names were synonymous with planetary destruction took their places in the hierarchy of slaughter. Fleets were not constructed, they were willed into being. Great, jagged vessels of brass and bone, studded with cannons that fired pure rage, coalesced from the very stuff of the war. These were not ships in the mortal sense. They were weapons of conceptual warfare, designed to break not just hulls, but the laws of physics themselves. At the heart of this Gortide fleet was the Throne of Wrath, Kajagathrax's personal leviathan, a fortress demon ship so vast that its spire was said to be built from the petrified spine of a slain god. Souls were the fuel, the currency, the very essence of the Crusade's power. Vast soul forges, wrenched from their moorings in the warp, were chained to the Gortide, their fires stoked with the spirits of 1,000 forgotten wars. These would provide the raw power needed to tear open the veil and sustain the demonic legions in the chillingly ordered reality of the Materium. The Crusade was not just an army. It was a self-sustaining engine of metaphysical destruction. Its target was chosen, the Veiled Arm, a region of Segmentum Pacificus deemed quiet and unremarkable by the sprawling bureaucracy of the Imperium. Its very insignificance made it perfect. It was a blank canvas awaiting the master's stroke. The Crusade would fall upon it not as a storm, but as a geological event, an extinction-level impact from another reality. Kajagathrax stood on the observation dais of the Throne of Wrath. The raw chaos of his assembling legions spread below him like a sea of fire. He held World Ender aloft, and its edge hummed with a terrible thirst. The Crimson Prophecy was no longer a vision, it was a plan of battle, and the first stroke was about to fall. The passage from the Sea of Souls into the cold, brittle reality of the Materium was not a journey, but an act of violation. For the Blood-Sworn Crusade, it was like a blade punching through a taut, pale skin. Reality screamed as the Gortide fleet ripped its way into existence. There was no shimmering translation, no gentle emergence from the immaterium. Space itself tore open in a wound 1,000,000 kilometers long, a jagged, frothing tear that bled raw chaos into the void. From this gaping injury, the fleet poured forth not like ships, but like a torrent of clotted blood and brass shrapnel. The Throne of Wrath, a mountain of demonic rage given form, was first, its colossal prow shattering nascent star stuff and shouldering aside asteroid fields as if they were dust. In its wake came the legions, a fleet of nightmares that drank the light of distant stars and radiated an aura of palpable murder that warped the very fabric of spacetime around them. Their target lay before them, the Idari cluster. From the perspective of the Immaterium, it had been a mote of defiant order, a collection of tiny lights signifying life and logic. Now, viewed from within the Materium, it was a chain of 7 star systems, quiet, unassuming, and utterly doomed. Its primary system, Idari Prime, was orbited by 3 inhabited worlds, a green agri-world, a gray mining moon, and a hive spire that scraped the toxic yellow sky. To the Imperium, it was a tax-paying, soul-rendering subsector of minor importance. To Kajagathrax, it was the tip of the brush he would use to paint a masterpiece of damnation across the galactic arm. The first mortals to witness the arrival of the end were the crew of the Imperial Navy Patrol Squadron Vigilant Blade, 3 sword-class frigates, their hulls scarred from minor pirate engagements, their crews disciplined and proud. On the bridge of the lead vessel, the Emperor's Mercy, Captain Valerius Kane watched his Auspex screens dissolve into screaming. Static. Tech priests chanted frantic litanies of appeasement, striking their consoles with blessed mechadendrites, but the machine spirits were cowering in terror. Before them, a wound had opened in the universe. By the throne, Kane whispered, his practiced composure shattering like glass. The scale was impossible. The sensorium could not resolve the readings. It was like trying to measure a god with a yardstick. They were not ships, they were concepts. Rage, hate, and the promise of a violent death made manifest in hulls of bone and fortifications of ever-bleeding brass. Unidentified fleet, the Vox officer stammered, his voice cracking. You have entered a restricted zone of the Imperium of Man. Identify yourselves or you will be fired upon. The only reply was a psychic shockwave of pure, unadulterated bloodlust that rolled through the 3 frigates. Crew members collapsed, screaming, blood pouring from their eyes and ears. Astropaths writhed on their sanctum floors, their minds incinerated by the raw hatred that permeated the void. The response from the Gortide was not a communication, but an act of contemptuous violence. From the vanguard, Angrath the Unbound, aboard his fortress ship, Skull Cleaver, gave a silent command. Cannons that lined the demonic vessels did not fire shells, but bolts of condensed rage. Beams of incandescent fury lanced across the void, striking the Emperor's Mercy. They did not explode against its shields. They dissolved them, boiling away the void shields in an instant before melting through the adamantium hull as if it were wax. The frigate was gutted from bow to stern, its reactor core detonating in a brief, silent flash of plasma that was greedily swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The other two frigates, their crews driven mad, fired their weapon batteries in a final act of defiance. Their torpedoes detonated uselessly against the Skull Cleaver's hide. In return, the demonic vessel did not even deign to fire its main batteries. It simply accelerated, its impossible mass moving with a predator's grace, and rammed the first frigate. The sound of tearing metal and dying screams was a silent symphony in the void. The third was swatted aside by a colossal flail that extended from the flagship's flank, shattering its spine and sending it tumbling, a dead hulk, into the dark. In less than a minute, the Imperial presence was erased. Then came the true slaughter. The Crusade ignored the empty worlds and gas giants, focusing its baleful gaze upon the three inhabited planets of the Idari system. A rain of fire descended, but it was not orbital bombardment. It was a deluge of daemons. Bloodletters, their forms shimmering into existence within the planet's atmospheres, fell like crimson meteors. They materialized in the heart of cities, on the plazas of the Hybespire, and in the sprawling agri-fields of Idari Primus. The planetary defense forces were overwhelmed in moments, their lasgun fire pattering harmlessly off the warp-toughened hides of the Daemons. The slaughter was not a battle, it was a harvest. Umbrakar the Skull-Taker led the ground assault on the main hive, his personal legion of blood crushers smashing through the hab blocks and defense lines. The screams of billions became a chorus, a rising crescendo of terror and pain that was music to the ears of the blood god. The blood of the slain did not merely stain the ground, it seeped into the very essence of the worlds. The fertile soil of Idari Primus turned to gore-soaked mud. The sterile rockcrete of the hive became slick with viscera. The air itself grew thick and coppery with the stench of death. This was the true purpose. Every life taken, every drop of blood spilled, was being channeled. The planets themselves were being transformed into sacrificial altars. From the bridge of the Throne of Wrath, Kajagathrax and the other 7 Exalted Bloodthirsters watched the psychic feedback pour in. The raw emotion, the death agony of trillions of souls across the 3 worlds, was a tide of power that made the very Materium howl in ecstasy. When the last mortal life on the mining moon was extinguished by a tide of flesh hounds, a psychic tremor shook the system. When the final hive dweller was impaled upon a bloodletter's hellblade, the tremor became a roar. Now, the final act of the first stroke began. The 8 Bloodthirsters raised their weapons in unison, each a focal point for a portion of the harvested death energy. The entire Gortide fleet became a single vast weapon. The sigils carved into their hulls glowed with hellish light, channeling the agony of the slaughtered worlds into a single, cohesive beam of pure annihilation. The beam did not fire at the system's sun, it pierced it, lancing through the star's photosphere and into its very heart. It was not an injection of energy, but of an idea, the idea of murder. The star, a being of fusion and light, was force-fed the concept of its own death, poisoned by the rage of its own extinguished children. The Idari sun convulsed. Its golden corona flickered and turned a sickly, bruised purple. Vast, dark sunspots spread across its surface like blossoming cancers. Solar flares erupted not as light, but as gouts of tangible despair, black fire that consumed light itself. For a moment, the star swelled, turning a deep, bloody crimson, bathing the dead worlds in a final, apocalyptic twilight. Then, with a shudder that vibrated through the structure of reality itself, it did not explode. It collapsed. It died. It was snuffed out like a candle flame, imploding into a sphere of perfect, silent blackness that radiated not gravity, but a chilling, soul-crushing void. Where a sun had burned for billions of years, there was now only a hole in the universe. The first brushstroke was complete. Kajagathrax let out a guttural roar of satisfaction that echoed in the minds of every daemon in his fleet. The Idari cluster was no more. In its place, on the grand tapestry of the galaxy, was a stain of utter darkness, a silent testament to their purpose. The Blood-Sworn Crusade, without pausing, without savoring the kill, turned its prows towards its next target. The silence of stars was the first note in a song that would end the galaxy. The death of the Idari sun did not travel through the galaxy as light, but as a scream. It was a psychic death rattle of such profound and absolute violence that it tore through the fragile minds of the astropathic choirs across a dozen sectors. On the relay station of Cygnus Exir, the Transcendent Choir, 100 souls bound in psychic harmony sang their last note. It was not a song of praise to the god emperor, but a single unified shriek of terror as their minds were simultaneously filled with the image of a black star and the overwhelming sensation of being murdered. Their skulls exploded in a synchronized shower of bone and gore, their sanctum instantly becoming a charnel house. On hundreds of ships, lone astropaths clawed out their own eyes, babbling of a laughing, brassy thirst that drank stars. The message network of the Veiled Arm did not just fail. It was cauterized, leaving a gaping wound of silence in the great weave of Imperial communication. But echoes, fragmented and nightmarish, still reached their destinations. The most coherent fragment, a psychic shard of pure agony, found its way to the Segmentum command fortress on Pacificus Prime. It pierced the psychic wards of the Bastion Imperialis and slammed into the mind of Lord High Admiral Hestor Vance. He was an old man, his body kept vital by augmetics and rejuvenate treatments, but his eyes held the wariness of a century spent staring into the abyss of the void, fighting the endless wars of the Sachebil's millennia. He was in his Strategium, a cavernous chamber where a hololithic map of the entire Segmentum glittered like a captured galaxy. When the message struck, he did not scream. He staggered back, his hand clutching the hilt of his ceremonial power sword, the psychic impact feeling like a physical blow. The air in the room grew cold, and for a moment, the shimmering star map seemed to flicker and dim. "Report," he commanded, his voice a low growl that betrayed none of the soul-deep chill he felt. A panicked chorus of vox chatter erupted from the command staff. Reports of astropathic burnout across the subsectors closest to the Veiled Arm. The Idari cluster had gone dark, utterly silent. No patrol check-ins, no tithe reports, no signals of any kind. It had simply ceased to exist on the network. Vance was a veteran of countless campaigns. He had fought Orc, WAAGHs that blotted out stars and Tyranid splinter fleets that devoured worlds. He had seen the treacherous fleets of the archenemy burn systems in their blasphemous crusades. But this was different. This was not the noise of war, but the sound of absolute silence. It was a cancer of stillness spreading across his map. He dispatched long-range scout clippers and automated probe fleets. Their orders simple: observe, report, do not engage. The first reports that trickled back weeks later were more terrifying than any battle summary he had ever read. Where the Idari system should have been, there was nothing. Not wreckage, not a stellar nursery born of a supernova, but a hole. A sphere of void, so black it seemed to absorb the light from surrounding stars. Auspex readings returned gibberish, cascades of impossible data that spoke of localized paradoxes and violations of physical law. The machine spirits of the probes that got too close went insane, their cogitators burning out as they transmitted final, garbled images of leering, brass-faced monstrosities, laughing from within the blackness. Hestor Vance understood. This was not a Xenos incursion. This was not a traitor legion seeking a new empire. This was an attack on reality itself. He stood before the hololith, the silent stain of the Idari cluster a personal affront to the order he had sworn his life to uphold. He gave the order. The full weight of Segmentum Pacificus was to be roused. Ancient protocols, dormant for centuries, were invoked. Fleets on anti-piracy patrols were recalled. Armies being mustered for distant crusades were rerouted. From the vast shipyards of Kar-Duniash and Sipramundi, the call went out, and the slumbering might of the Imperial Navy began to stir. Battle fleets, cruisers, and squadrons of destroyers began the slow, ponderous process of gathering at the designated rally point, the heavily fortified naval base orbiting the star of Orthax. The call also went to the Adeptus Astartes. In their mountain-ringed fortress monastery on Argent, the Silver Skulls received the summons. Their prognosticars had already been reeling, their divinatory visions clouded by a sea of boiling blood, and the incessant, rhythmic pounding of a monstrous heart. The tarot showed only the tower and the emperor reversed, again and again. When the Lord Admiral's plea for aid arrived, Chapter Master Darius Argentius saw not a request, but a confirmation of their darkest fears. He was a creature of logic and adherence to the Codex, a true son of Guilliman, but the cold calculus of the situation was undeniable. An enemy that could erase stars was a threat to the very foundations of the Imperium. With the assent of his council, he committed the full strength of the chapter. Their battle barge, the Omnis Arcanum, and their fleet of strike cruisers, gleaming silver in the light of their home star, broke orbit and set a course for Orthax, 1,000 light-years away. Within the cold, silent halls of their mobile fortress monastery, the Phalanx Primus, The Star Phantoms received the same message. There was no debate. There was no council. Chapter Master Zhrukal, a giant clad in bone-white Terminator armor, his face a mask of grim-scar tissue, read the astropathic dispatch. He looked at his honor guard, their silence as profound and unyielding as his own. To the Star Phantoms, war was not a glory to be sought, but a final, fatalistic duty to be performed. They were the Emperor's final sanction, the wielders of his most devastating wrath. Zhrukal crushed the data slate in his gauntlet. "We answer the call," he rumbled, his voice like stones grinding together. The entire chapter, masters of void warfare and attritional sieges, prepared for war. At Orthax, the fleet that gathered was a sight not seen in the segmentum for a millennium. It was a forest of steel spires, a city of void ships that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Over 300 capital ships of the Imperial Navy, from the colossal Emperor-class battleship Fist of Righteousness that would serve as Vance's flagship, to phalanxes of lunar-class cruisers and squadrons of Cobra-class destroyers. They were joined by the dark, inscrutable vessels of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Arc Mechanicus ships whose ancient weaponry defied comprehension. And at the heart of this steel armada, like jewels of death, were the fleets of the Astartes, the silver ships of the Silver Skulls, the bone-white cruisers of the Star Phantoms. And they were not alone. The Adamant Wardens, the Storm Falcons, and a dozen other chapters had answered the call, sending battle barges and strike cruisers to join the growing host. This grand coalition was given a name, one that would be whispered in hope and fear for the coming years: the Argent Bulwark. It was to be a wall of adamantium and righteous fury set against an unknowable tide. Lord High Admiral Hestor Vance assumed supreme command, a council of Astartes chapter masters and Mechanicus Magi forming his war cabinet. In the vast assembly hall of the Fist of Righteousness, Vance stood before the grim-faced commanders. The hololith showed the spreading stain of the Khorne Crusade. Another system had just gone dark. "We face an enemy that does not seek to conquer, but to unmake," Vance declared, his voice resonating with the authority of a lifetime of command. "They do not want our worlds. They want our light. We are not fighting for territory. We are fighting for the right of our stars to exist. We are the Argent Bulwark. We will hold the line, and we will not fail." The fleet resonated with a grim purpose, its engines burning with the fire of a billion suns, ready to sail into a darkness of a kind no mortal man had ever faced before. The world of Kaist hung in the void like a ball of rusted iron, wrapped in a shroud of ochre smog. From the viewports of the Gortide, it was a masterpiece of mortal arrogance. Its surface was a continent-spanning machine, a single integrated circuit of manufactorums, forge temples, and weapon foundries, all interconnected by a web of maglev lines and continent-spanning pipelines that pulsed with sluggish, superheated chemicals. Its cities were not hives, but macroclades, emotionless structures of brutalist efficiency. No parks, no plazas, no art, only function. Kaist was a world that had surgically excised its soul in the name of logic, a planet dedicated to the cold, sterile calculus of production. It was a blasphemy against the very nature of passionate, violent existence, and it was the designated anvil upon which the blood god's hammer would fall. It was a critical vertex in the Great Rune, its destruction necessary to anchor the ritual's power in the Materium. Kajagathrax watched it grow on the main pick screen of the Throne of Wrath, a display wrought from a captured shard of a Tsientian mirror that showed not just the physical, but the spiritual reality of the world. He saw the trillions of ordered, disciplined thoughts of the tech priests and Skitarii, a monotonous hum of logic that was a grating insult to the glorious cacophony of war. "It is a cage," the Gore Shepherd growled, the sound a grinding of stone in the chamber. "Break it." The assault did not begin with orbital bombardment. Such a tactic was too impersonal, too clean. Khorne demanded blood spilled by the blade, skulls taken by hand. Instead, the skies of Kaist tore open. Reality fractured above the largest forged temples as the Gortide vomited forth its legions. A rain of crimson and brass fell from the poisoned clouds, a storm of daemons that descended upon the planet's surface. Bloodletters, their forms coalescing from the raw stuff of the warp, materialized in discipline. Phalanxes on the Ironcrete plains between manufactorums. Blood crushers, their juggernauts snorting steam and damnation, slammed into the ground with the force of meteorites. carving craters in the adamantium-plated roadways. Flesh hounds, packs of living rage, poured from the rents in the sky, their howls a counterpoint to the wail of Keist's defense siren. The Adeptus Mechanicus of Keist was not unprepared for war, but they were unprepared for this kind of war. Their logic engines had predicted fleet engagements, orbital drops, and siege warfare. They had not predicted an invasion from a direction that did not exist. Nevertheless, their response was immediate and brutally efficient. From colossal blast doors in the sides of the forged temples, the Skitarii legions marched forth. They were a tide of red robes and cold steel, their movements perfectly synchronized, their bionic limbs whirring in the smoggy air. Radium carbines and galvanic rifles spat their lethal energies, filling the air with a green, crackling haze. Cohorts of Skitarii rangers took up positions on gantries and rooftops, their long rifles seeking the heads of skull cannons and the weak points of demonic beasts. The initial clash was a collision of fundamental opposites. The chaotic, screaming charge of the Daemons met the unyielding, emotionless firing lines of the Skitarii. Daemons dissolved into ectoplasm under concentrated volleys of radiation and electricity. But for every one that fell, 3 more took its place, their fury undiminished. The bloodletters crashed into the Skitarii lines, and the cold logic of ranged warfare devolved into a primitive, screaming melee. Hellblades, glowing with incandescent rage, clashed against the crackling energy fields of taser goads. The cog-tooth axes of the vanguard whirred as they hacked at demonic flesh, their radium saturation bleeding the very life force from the warp-spawned creatures. But the Daemons were relentless. They were the physical embodiment of the act of killing, and against the frail half-flesh of the Skitarii, they were devastatingly effective. The battlefield became a Boschian nightmare of industry and slaughter. Castellan robots, their twin-linked phosphor blasters glowing white-hot, strode through the chaos, incinerating entire packs of fleshhounds with each volley, only to be swarmed by blood crushers, who slammed into them with the force of freight trains, tearing them apart with brutal, metallic claws. Onager dune crawlers, their spider-like legs picking a careful path through the wreckage, fired their neutron lasers, beams of pure annihilation that vaporized everything they touched. But they were high-value targets, and demonic heralds on blood-soaked thrones directed waves of bloodletters to scale their armored legs, prying open hatches and slaughtering the gun crews within. Umbrakar the Skulltaker was in his element. He strode through the thickest of the fighting, his great axe cleaving Skitarii in two, their augmetics sparking and failing as their organic components were pulped. He roared challenges that sent scrap code shrieking through the Mechanicus noosphere, a pure blast of primal rage that overloaded the logic circuits of nearby combat servitors. Beside him, Kyrus the Eight-Bladed fought with a different kind of fury. Where Umbrakar was a bludgeon, Kyrus was a scalpel. His 8 enchanted blades, a whirlwind of death that dismembered Sicarian ruststalkers and beheaded Kataphron destroyers with contemptuous ease. But the true masters of Kist had yet to play their hand. As the demonic tide threatened to overwhelm the primary forge complex of Archimedes Major, the ground began to tremble. A new sound joined the din of battle, a war horn so deep and resonant it vibrated in the very marrow of bone and the core of daemonic being. From the heart of the complex, within a fortified titangent pen whose gates were the size of starship hulls, the god machines of the Legio Vulcanum emerged. First came the warhounds, scouting ahead, their lithe, canine forms moving with a predatory speed that belied their immense size. Their turbolaser destructors spat lances of blinding light that carved molten furrows through the demonic ranks. Then came the Reavers, their hunched, aggressive postures radiating menace, their apocalypse missile launchers unleashing salvos that blanketed entire sections of the battlefield in fire and shrapnel. Finally, dwarfing them all, came the warlords. They were walking cathedrals of war, their silhouettes so vast they blotted out the smog-choked sky. Their tread was an earthquake. The roar of their plasma annihilators was the birth of a new star. A single shot from a warlord's bellicosa volcano cannon struck a concentration of blood crushers, and in a silent flash of white-hot energy, 1,000 tons of daemon, brass, and rage were simply gone, leaving only a crater of glassy slag. The arrival of the Titans staggered the demonic assault. These were not mere machines. They were idols of war, animated by the spirits of long-dead princeps and imbued with a reverence that gave them a quasi-mystical power. For a moment, the chaotic tide faltered before these avatars of ordered destruction. But it was only for a moment. To the great Bloodthirsters, the Titans were not gods. They were challenges. They were the largest, most worthy skulls on a planet full of them. A bellow of pure, exultant rage erupted from the demonic host, a challenge answered in kind by the deafening klaxons of the god machines. Umbrakhar beat his wings, a powerful downburst of air clearing the smoke around him, and fixed his burning gaze on the lead warlord, the Ignis Purgatio. He saw not a machine, but a worthy adversary, a monument to the Imperium's martial pride that he would personally tear down. The true battle for the Anvil of Keist had just begun. The battlefield of Keist transformed. What had been a grinding war of attrition between infantry became a battlefield of gods and monsters. The Legio Vulcanum, the Fire Masters, advanced in a stately, implacable line, their every step a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the forge complexes. Their coordinated volleys were a symphony of destruction, a calculated application of overwhelming force that erased swathes of the demonic legion from existence. The plasma annihilator of the Ignis Purgatio fired, and a river of bloodletters turned to incandescent steam. The volcano cannon of the Vulcan's anvil discharged its payload, and a greater brass scorpion, a formidable daemon engine, was simply punched through its center, its molten innards spraying across the battlefield before it collapsed into a heap of twitching, metallic limbs. For the lesser daemons, this was a force beyond their comprehension, an expression of cold, technological fury that their rage alone could not overcome. They threw themselves at the Titan's ion shields, their bodies dissolving into harmless flares of warp energy against the shimmering blue barriers. They swarmed the legs of the god machines, only to be systematically scoured away by storms of fire from Vulcan megabolters and Gatling blasters. The Skitarii legions, heartened by the arrival of their gods of war, rallied. They formed disciplined cordons around the Titan's feet, their concentrated fire cutting down any daemon that survived the apocalyptic barrages from above. The logic of the machine god seemed ascendant, but Kajagathrax and his brethren did not deal in logic. They dealt in fury, in audacity, in the sublime and terrible art of the kill. From the observation deck of the Throne of Wrath, the Gore Shepherd watched the advance of the Titans. He saw the cold pride of the mortals, their faith in their steel idol. He saw the flaw in their thinking. They believed the battle was on the ground. Umbrakhar, the Skulltaker, knew this instinctively. He watched the Ignis Purgatio stride through his legions, its every weapon firing in a perfectly calculated arc of death. It was magnificent, a truly worthy skull for the throne. But it was slow, it was ponderous, and its head, the command sanctum where its mortal princeps resided, was a tantalizingly small target against the blood-red sky. He let out a roar that was not just a sound, but a command that resonated in the warp stuff of his chosen warriors. From the highest spires of the captured manufactorums and from the rents in reality that still bled into the upper atmosphere, his answer to the Titans took flight. They were the Furies of Khorne, vast swarms of winged, leering daemons whose forms were a mockery of mortal notions of aerodynamics. And with them came the Helldrakes, dragon-like daemon engines, their bodies a twisted fusion of metal and muscle, their wings tipped with scythe-like claws. They were not an air force, they were a plague of airborne slaughter. They descended from the smoggy skies, not in formations, but in a shrieking chaotic torrent, a storm of claws and teeth and balefire. The anti-aircraft batteries of Kist, a dense network of Hydra platforms and autocannon emplacements, erupted in a cacophony of fire. The sky filled with flak, a curtain of explosions that shredded the lesser Furies by the thousand. But the tide was endless. The Helldrakes, their armored hides shrugging off all but the most direct hits, dove through the storm of steel. They did not engage in dogfights. They slammed headlong into the gun emplacements, their claws tearing apart turrets and their bay flamers incinerating the crews within. They raked their talons across the gantries, sending Skitarii Rangers plummeting to their deaths hundreds of meters below. This aerial assault was the distraction. It was the glorious, bloody overture to the main performance. At its heart, leading the charge, was Umbrakhar. He beat his vast, leathery wings, each stroke a thunderclap that propelled him upwards, a rising crimson comet of pure rage. Around him, his elite guard, a hand-picked cadre of the most powerful bloodletters, clung to the backs of colossal, bat-winged, demonic steeds known as Blood Gorgers. This was the Skulltaker's personal host, the executioners of his will. They ignored the ground battle, their eyes fixed on a single prize, the command bridge of the Ignis Purgatio. The Titans' void shields flickered as the demonic swarm crashed against them. Helldrakes exploded in showers of warp fire as they suicidally rammed the energy barriers. But Umbrakhar was not a mindless beast. He was a general of Khorne. He saw the pattern, the rhythmic pulse of the shield generators as they struggled to repel the unending assault. He saw the flicker, the momentary weakness after a major impact. Now, he roared, the command a psychic spear. He dove. At the precise moment, a trio of Helldrakes immolated themselves against the warlord's forward shield, creating a momentary ripple of vulnerability. Umbrakhar and his host plunged through. They slammed onto the adamantium carapace of the Titan's head with the force of an artillery strike. The sound of their impact was a deep, resonant boom that was felt by the princeps and moderati within. For a moment, there was confusion on the bridge. An external impact alarm shrieked, but the shield integrity was still high. Then the tearing began. Umbrakhar's axe, a weapon forged in the heat of a dying star's rage, bit into the Titan's armored plating. It was not steel he was cleaving, but a slab of plasteel and adamantium 20 meters thick. Sparks the size of boulders flew with every swing. His bloodletter guard used their hellblades, not as swords, but as supernatural cutting torches, their incandescent edges melting through the welds and joints of the Titan's armor. They were ants on a beetle, but they were ants with the strength and fury of gods. Inside the command sanctum, Princeps Majoris Kalen watched his displays with cold fury. Repel borders, scour the carapace, he commanded. Automated defense turrets swiveled, spewing heavy bolter shells across the Titan's head. The storm of fire tore apart some of the lesser daemons, but Umbrakhar was a being of myth. He moved through the hail of fire as if it were rain, his hide turning aside shells that could shred a battle tank. He raised his axe high, the weapon glowing with an impossible heat, and brought it down in a final cataclysmic blow. With a scream of protesting metal, a section of the carapace buckled, tore, and was ripped away. Umbrakhar tore the slab of armor free with his bare hands and hurled it into the sky, where it tumbled, end over end like a discarded toy. He dropped into the breach, landing on the command deck of the Ignis Purgatio. The scene within was one of cold, technological order. The princeps sat enthroned in his amniotic tank, his mind linked to the machine's spirit. Moderati and tech priests manned their stations, their faces illuminated by the green glow of their screens. For a frozen second, the two worlds stared at each other, the epitome of cold logic and the embodiment of hot, unrestrained rage. The moment broke. Umbrakhar let out a roar that shattered the armored glass of the viewports and sent the tech priests reeling, their augmetic ears bleeding fluid. He was a whirlwind of death. His axe swept across the deck, bisecting consoles and the unfortunate crew who manned them. His bloodletter host poured in after him, a crimson tide that washed over the bridge in a wave of slaughter. Princeps Kalen, his physical body helpless in its tank, could only watch in horror as his crew was butchered. His last act was to try and overload the Titan's plasma reactor to deny the enemy their prize. But a hellblade plunged through the amniotic tank, piercing his heart and severing his connection to the god machine. The Ignis Purgatio, its mind gone, its spirit extinguished, shuddered. Its movements became erratic, its weapons falling silent. It took a single stumbling step, crushing a cohort of its own Skitarii protectors, before it began to fall. It fell like a felled giant, a slow, majestic, and terrible descent, crashing into the heart of the Archimedes Major Forge complex with an impact that registered on the planet's seismic sensors. The shockwave flattened everything for a kilometer in every direction. The Titan's death was a signal. The head of the Legio Vulcanum had been severed. Umbrakhar, the Skulltaker, stood atop the fallen god machine, his form silhouetted against the flames of its ruin, and raised his blood-soaked axe to the sky. A legend of slaughter had been born, and the tide of the battle for Kaist had turned irrevocably to blood. While Kaist burned under the boots of Daemons and the treads of gods, Lord High Admiral Hestor Vance watched the unfolding catastrophe from a universe away. On the command deck of the Fist of Righteousness, the hololithic display was a mural of despair. Red runes, signifying total system loss, bloomed across the veiled arm like a fatal pox. The Idari cluster was a black void. The Xylos Reach, another vertex point in the Cornate rune, had just gone silent, its astropathic death scream a faint, pathetic echo by the time it reached the Argent Bulwark. And now, the icon for the Forge world of Kaist, a vital linchpin of the Segmentum's military-industrial complex, pulsed with a frantic, angry crimson, signifying a world under siege by a major demonic incursion. Vance stood with his arms clasped behind his back, his face a mask of granite. Beside him stood the luminaries of his war council, Chapter Master Darius Argentius of the Silver Skulls, his silver armor gleaming in the soft light of the Strategium, and Chapter Master Druckle of the Star Phantoms, a silent, brooding mountain of bone-white ceramite. The reports from Keist were fragmented, relayed by desperate astropaths and long-range Mechanicus probes, but they painted a clear and horrifying picture. A demonic fleet of impossible size, a gore tide that defied all naval logic, held the system in an iron grip. A direct fleet engagement was suicide. To throw the Argent bulwark against that wall of brass and rage would be to send hundreds of capital ships and millions of souls to a pointless, violent death. The demonic fleet did not fight like a mortal navy. It fought like a force of nature, and to sail into it was to sail into a hurricane's eye. "We cannot break the siege," Argentius stated, his voice calm and analytical, betraying none of the cold fury he felt. "Our numbers are vast, but theirs are conceptual. Auspex cannot lock onto their hulls for sustained firing solutions. Their weapon yields fluctuate according to principles that defy physics. A direct assault is a tactical fallacy." Druckle, who had not spoken for the entire meeting, finally rumbled. "Attrition is their weapon. To meet them on their terms is to bleed for their god." Vance nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the pulsing icon of Keist. He knew they were right. He had seen the after-action reports from the annihilated patrol squadrons. He had read the maddeningly incoherent data from the scout probes. The Argent Bulwark was the most powerful military force assembled in the Segmentum for 1,000 years, and it was impotent. A direct confrontation was exactly what the enemy wanted. They craved the glorious ship-to-ship slaughter, the bloodletting in the void. He would not give it to them. "Then we will not fight their war," Vance declared, his voice cutting through the funereal atmosphere of the bridge. "We will fight ours." He gestured, and a junior officer adjusted the hololith. The tactical display zoomed out, showing not just the Keist system, but the entire projected path of the Blood-Sworn Crusade, the lines of the Great Rune drawn in blood across the star chart based on the prognosticar's terrified divinations and the cold logic of astrometrics. "This is not a mindless horde," Vance continued, tracing a line behind the main demonic fleet. "This is an army, a crusade. And every army, even one made of nightmares, has a supply line." The chapter masters looked closer. The display now highlighted faint, ghost-like trails of warp energy, residual signatures that lagged behind the main gore tide. They were weaker, more dispersed, but they were there. "What are we seeing, Lord Admiral?" Argentius asked. "The enemy's belly," Vance replied, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "The crusade is powered by ritual. It is sustained by soul forges, dimensional anchors, and ritual convoys that are dragging pieces of their hell realm with them to fuel this undertaking. They are not as fast, not as heavily armed as the primary fleet. They are the logistical train. They are the weak point." A new strategy began to form, one of daring, risk, and utter ruthlessness. Vance would not throw his fleet against the anvil of the gore tide. He would become a ghost. He would take a portion of his fastest, most powerful ships, a fleet within a fleet, and he would not travel through conventional warp lanes. He would use the forgotten, treacherous passages, the unstable back alleys of the Materium that were deemed too dangerous for regular naval traffic. These routes were fraught with peril. Ships could be lost to temporal eddies, devoured by warp predators, or simply cease to exist. But they were routes. The demonic host, confident in its mastery of the warp, would not be watching. The plan was named Operation Ghost. Vance himself would lead it. He selected a corps of 50 vessels, the very tip of the Argent Bulwark's spear. His flagship, the Fist of Righteousness, was too slow, too ponderous. He would transfer his command to the stalwart Fury, a grand cruiser renowned for its powerful engines and veteran crew. He was joined by a dozen Mars-class battlecruisers, squadrons of Dauntless-class light cruisers, and the fastest destroyers in the fleet. Crucially, the Star Phantoms, masters of void warfare and boarding actions, committed their entire fleet to the Ghost Fleet. Chapter Master Druckle and his bone-white battle barge, the Phalanx Primus, would be the hammer of this raiding force. The objective was simple and brutal. They would fall upon the Crusade's rear echelons, the convoys of soul forges and ritual barges that trailed behind the main fleet like a comet's tail. They would not seek to destroy the gore tide, but to starve it. They would cut its metaphysical supply lines, hoping to weaken the Daemons fighting on Keist and slow the Crusade's inexorable advance. The departure of the Ghost Fleet was a somber affair. The bulk of the Argent Bulwark remained at Orthax, a static line of defense, a bastion, against which the Gore-Tide would hopefully break itself. But the true hope of the segmentum now lay with the small, swift fleet that detached itself from the main body and prepared to plunge into the unknown. On the bridge of the stalwart Fury, Vance watched the vast, reassuring shapes of the main fleet dwindle in the viewports. He was leaving the safety of numbers, the comfort of overwhelming firepower, and venturing into a war of shadows and ghosts. Navigator, lay in the course for the Serpent's Maw passage, Vance commanded, his voice steady. The Navigator Primus, a pale, gaunt figure in his shielded throne, bowed his head. The Serpent's Maw was a notoriously unstable warp route, a twisting corridor of reality that was prone to violent, unpredictable currents. It was a navigator's nightmare, but it was also their only path. With a shimmer of displaced reality, the Geller fields of the Ghost Fleet came to life, bathing the ships in a halo of eerie blue light. One by one, the 50 vessels tore open the fabric of space and plunged into the madness of the Materium. Their journey would not be measured in days or weeks, but in the number of horrors they survived. They would be assailed by psychic phantoms, hunted by never-born predators, and navigate currents of pure insanity that could shatter the minds of the entire crew. But Hester Vance was resolute. He was a hunter now, and his prey was the lifeline of an army of gods. He would sail through hell itself to sever it. The Ghost Fleet was away, a scalpel aimed at the heart of a monster. Within the seething, chaotic heart of the Gore-Tide, a discordance had begun to fester. It was not a doubt in their divine purpose, nor a fear of the mortal enemy. It was something far more insidious, a flaw inherent in the very nature of the creatures that comprised the Blood-Sworn Crusade: pride. The 8 exalted bloodthirsters of the Octavius Carnage were united in their devotion to Khorne, but they were also rivals, apex predators in a constant, unspoken struggle for glory and the favor of their god. While Thrax, the Gore Shepherd, remained utterly focused on the grand, cosmic scale of the ritual, others began to crave a more personal, more immediate form of worship. Chief among these was Kyrus the Eight-Bladed. Where Thrax was a being of immense geological fury, Kyrus was a whirlwind of martial arrogance. He was a duelist, a weapons master whose 8 enchanted hellblades moved with a speed that defied perception. He had fought alongside Umbrakar on the surface of Kaist, and while the Skulltaker's brutal decapitation of the Legio Vulcanum had earned him renown, Kyrus felt his own considerable tally of kills had been overlooked. He had personally slaughtered the entire Skitaria Macroclade Alpha Quo and laid low 3 Night Titans of House Tyrannus. Yet the chorus of slaughter in the warp sang Umbrakar's name, not his. A seed of resentment, a shard of brassy jealousy, began to take root in his demonic heart. He watched the crusade move on from the burning ruin of Kaist, leaving behind a world scoured of life and logic. Their next target, according to the Crimson Prophecy, was a series of lifeless asteroid belts and void stations in the Lethe subsector. These were strategically worthless, barren rocks, but their orbital positions formed a crucial connecting line in the Great Rune. To Kyrus, this was an insult. To spill blood upon dead rock was a waste of his sublime talents. The blood god craved skulls, yes, but surely the Eschios of pious champions and defiant warriors were more valuable than those of rockhoppers and void miners. His gaze was drawn to a nearby star system on the Crusade's periphery, a system that lay pointedly outside the ritual's path. It was the cardinal world of St. Praxilla's Fall. It shone in the warp not with the cold logic of Kaist, but with the cloying sanctimonious light of faith. It was a beacon of the corpse god's power, home to a dozen major shrines, the fortress convent of the Order of the Valorous Heart, and a population of billions whose lives were dedicated to prayer and worship. The psychic effluence of their devotion was a sickeningly sweet perfume in the Immaterium, an affront to the honest, brutal purity of rage. To Kyrus, it was an irresistible target. To topple such a monument of faith, to personally slay the canoness of the Sororitas and cast down her holy relics, would be a glorious victory. It would be a slaughter that would echo through the warp, a testament to his personal prowess that could not be ignored. It would earn him a glory that the methodical void painting of Thrax could not. He began to sow dissent among his own legion, the Legion of the Eightfold Slice. He spoke not of betrayal, but of opportunity. He whispered to his heralds and schoolmasters that the Gore Shepherd had grown too obsessed with his cosmic artistry, forgetting the simple, beautiful truth of Khorne. The value of the skull is measured by the strength of its owner. What glory was there in butchering nameless Mechanicus serfs or asteroid miners? True glory lay in extinguishing the brightest lights of the enemy, in turning their hope to bloody despair. His words found fertile ground. The daemons of his legion, creatures of impulse and violence, were easily swayed by the promise of a more satisfying, more personal slaughter. Without seeking the counsel of the Octavus Carnage, Kyrus acted. In the chaos of the Gore Tide's transit between systems, he ordered his flagship, the Razor Storm Bastion, and its attendant fleet of slaughter cruisers to break formation. A significant portion of the crusade, nearly a full eighth of its total strength, peeled away from the main host, altering its course for the gleaming light of St. Praxilla's fall. It was a clean, swift maneuver, and by the time Kajagathrax and the others realized what had happened, Kyrus's splinter fleet was already a bloody smear against the star charts, well on its way to its unsanctioned war. The rage that erupted from Kajagathrax was a tectonic event within the warp. On the bridge of the Throne of Wrath, reality itself flickered as the Gore Shepherd's fury manifested. Brass consoles melted, and lesser demonic servitors were incinerated where they stood. His roar of anger was a psychic blast that momentarily deafened every daemon in the fleet. This was not just disobedience, it was sacrilege. It was a violation of the sacred vision, a flaw deliberately introduced into a perfect act of worship. The Great Rune was a delicate cosmic equation of death, and Kyrus had just erased a vital part of the formula for the sake of his own vanity. The annihilation of the Lethe subsector was still necessary, but now the forces assigned to it were critically weakened. The synchronicity of the grand ritual was shattered. Angrath the Unbound counseled immediate pursuit and retribution. He argued that Kyrus should be made an example of, his essence scattered to the eight winds of the warp for his insolence, but Kajagathrax, for all his boundless fury, was bound by the prophecy. The timing of the ritual was paramount. To deviate from their path now, to punish the traitor, would be to compound the error, to introduce yet another flaw into the grand design. With a snarl that cracked the obsidian floor beneath his hooves, he made his decision. Kyrus and his renegades were on their own. They would find their glory or their doom, but the Blood-Sworn Crusade would not wait for them. It would press on, its numbers diminished, its perfect unity broken. The eighth betrayal had occurred. The splinter fleet of Kyrus the Eight-Bladed descended upon St. Praxilla's fall like a plague of locusts. The initial slaughter was immense. The orbital defenses were swept aside, and the demonic legions poured onto the surface, their fury amplified by the cloying sanctity of the world. They toppled cathedrals, desecrated shrines, and engaged in a world-spanning battle with the stoic and fanatically brave Sisters of Battle. The fighting was glorious, brutal, and exactly what Kyrus had craved. He personally led the charge into the sanctum of the Sacred Rose, his 8 blades of blur as he cut a path through the elite Celestian Guard. But the Cardinal World was not a soft target like a mining colony. It was a fortress of faith. The sheer psychic power of the martyred faithful acted as an anchor for the Imperial defenders, and the Sisters of the Valorous Heart fought with a fury that nearly matched the Daemons' own. The battle that should have been a swift, glorious slaughter bogged down into a grinding, attritional war. Kyrus found his glorious duel, facing Canoness Superior Genevieve in the heart of the Great Shrine. But for every sororitas he cut down, another 3 took her place, their faith a shield, their bolters spitting righteous fire. The easy victory he had envisioned, the swift reaping of worthy skulls, had turned into a quagmire. He had weakened the main crusade not for a swift triumph, but for a bloody stalemate, trapping a vital portion of their forces in a pointless war of vanity, miles from the true battlefield where the fate of the galaxy was being written. The flaw in the Grand Rune was now a gaping, bleeding wound. The carving of the Great Rune was more than an act of physical destruction. It was a form of cosmic vivisection. With each extinguished star system, each slaughtered world, the Blood-Sworn Crusade was not merely moving through the Materium, but actively unmaking it. The sheer concentration of violence, hatred, and ritual slaughter along their designated path began to have a catastrophic, cumulative effect on the very laws of existence. The fabric of reality, already stretched thin by the Great Rift, began to fray and tear under the strain. For the mortal inhabitants of the Veiled Arm, this was a new and profound form of terror. It was not just the fear of invasion, but the fear of their universe turning insane. On worlds hundreds of light years from the Crusade's immediate wrath, the signs began. In the depths of hive cities, physics would flicker. For a moment, gravity might reverse in a hab block, sending its inhabitants tumbling to their deaths against the ceiling before slamming them back down onto the floor. Reflections in mirrors would begin to move with a fractional delay, their expressions twisting into leering, bloodthirsty grin. The reassuringly constant hum of machinery would curdle into what sounded like distant, rhythmic chanting, a chorus of blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. These were not isolated warp phenomena, this was a systemic decay. The border between the Materium and the Immaterium, the veil that protected sane, ordered reality from the howling madness of the warp, was becoming permeable. Along the path the Gore Tide had already carved the black void of the Idari cluster, the slagged remains of Keist, the silent asteroid fields of Lethe, the effect was absolute. This region of space was no longer truly part of the Materium. It was a bleeding wound, a semi-permanent corridor into the realm of chaos, where Khornate energies seeped through like blood from an unstitched gash. The effect on void travel was catastrophic. Geller fields, the sacred technology that shielded ships during warp travel, began to fail with terrifying frequency. A routine freighter convoy, the Pride of Cypra, carrying vital promethium supplies, entered the Warpa sector away from the affected zone. Their journey should have been simple, but as they neared the region haunted by the Crusade's echo, their Geller fields did not just flicker, they were shredded by waves of pure rage emanating from the wounded reality. Of the 30 ships that entered the warp, only one emerged. The Emperor's Bounty, its hull crusted with blood-red crystalline growths, its crew fused into the bulkheads in screaming tableaus of agony. Its final, garbled Vox transmission was not a warning, but a single guttural war cry before its reactor detonated. This bleeding of reality created a new kind of enemy, one born from the Imperium's own populace. The psychic resonance of the endless slaughter began to infect the minds of mortals. On the industrial world of Vax Primus, a planet known for its stoic, hard-working populace, a single shift change siren sounded wrong. It held a brassy, discordant note that vibrated in the skulls of the workers. Within an hour, the entire factory floor had erupted into a homicidal riot. Workers turned on their overseers with industrial tools, their faces contorted in masks of ecstatic rage. The slaughter spread from factory to factory, a pandemic of violence that consumed the world in a single day. The Vax Primus uprising was not a rebellion for freedom or faith. It was a sudden, inexplicable descent into pure, unadulterated bloodlust. When the Astra Militarum arrived to restore order, they found a world of cannibals and murderers, a planet that had become a shrine to Khorne without a single daemon ever setting foot on it. The Argent Bulwark, holding its defensive line at Orthax, was not immune. Though the system was far from the main area of corruption, the tendrils of this metaphysical decay, on the lower decks of the battleship Indomitable Will, a brawl between two ratings over a spilled ration pack escalated with unnatural speed. Within minutes, the entire mess hall was a slaughterhouse. Men who had served together for years, tearing each other apart with improvised weapons in bare hand. The ship's commissars restored order with brutal summary executions, but the incident left a chilling pall over the entire fleet. The enemy was not just in the void ahead. It was a whisper in their own hearts, a latent rage in their own blood, waiting for the right note to be struck. For the Daemons of the Blood-Sworn Crusade, this decaying reality was a boon. The thinning veil made their manifestation easier, their presence in the Materium more stable. They no longer needed to cling to the immediate vicinity of the Gore Tide. Bloodletters could now remain coherent for longer, farther from the fleet, drawing sustenance from the growing rage field of the sector itself. The Crusade was becoming a self-perpetuating engine of damnation. The more it killed, the more reality bled. The more reality bled, the easier it was to kill. Kajagathrax stood before the Throne of Wrath's great mirror screen, observing the spreading stain on the map of reality. He saw the panicked, failing Geller fields, the worlds devouring themselves in mindless slaughter, the laws of physics groaning under the weight of his master's glory. The betrayal of Kyrus still angered him, a discordant note in his symphony of destruction, but the overall effect was undeniable. The Crimson Prophecy was being fulfilled. He was not just commanding a war, he was overseeing a transfiguration. He was turning a sterile, ordered arm of a mortal galaxy into a living, breathing testament to the Lord of Skulls. The Materium was beginning to bleed, and the flow was becoming a torrent. The cost in daemonic energy to sustain the crusade was lessening with every passing moment, as the universe itself was being converted into their fuel. The very air of the veiled arm was becoming thick with the promise of violence, a permanent echo of the Skull Throne's court. And for the servants of Khorne, it was beginning to feel like home. The Blood-Sworn Crusade, though wounded by Kyrus's betrayal and hounded by the ghostly raids of Admiral Vance's fleet, was a wounded god, still possessed of terrifying, inexorable momentum. It ground its way across the veiled arm, leaving a trail of dead stars and screaming realities in its wake. Now it approached the celestial centerpiece of its grand ritual, the keystone of the entire runic structure, the Praxis system. To the Imperium, Praxis was a navigational marvel, a binary star system whose two suns, Praxis Major, a brilliant yellow giant, and Praxis Minor, a smaller, hotter white dwarf, were locked in a graceful cosmic dance. For the Crusade, its gravitational and symbolic significance was absolute. Its annihilation would be the bleeding heart of the finished rune, the point from which the eternal worship of Khorne would pulse across the galactic arm forever. Holding this vital system was the Adamant Wardens, a Space Marine chapter forged in the fires of the Great Scouring. They were sons of Dorn, inheritors of his unyielding stoicism and his genius for siegecraft. Their fortress monastery was not on a planet, but was a vast orbital structure known as the Aegis of Praxis, a ringed battle station of macro cannons and lance batteries that encircled the system's primary inhabited world. Chapter Master Valerius was a living embodiment of his chapter's name. A warden, a guardian, his will as hard and unforgiving as the stone for which they were named. He had received the call to join the Argent Bulwark, but his duty was here. He knew Praxis would be a target. His prognosticars had screamed of two dying sons, and he would not abandon his post. He had spent months turning the entire system into a fortress, seeding the outer reaches with minefields the size of continents, and constructing a web of automated defense platforms. The arrival of the Gortide was not a surprise, but its scale was still a shock that tested even Valerius's iron composure. The demonic fleet did not bother with the outer defenses. It simply smashed through them, the minefields detonating against their hulls in silent, useless flashes of light. The Aegis of Praxis opened fire, its colossal batteries spitting shells and energy beams that could cripple battleships. The initial volleys struck true, shattering several of the smaller slaughter cruisers. But the main body of the fleet weathered the storm as if it were a light rain, their impossible hulls repairing themselves with congealed rage. The true defense of Praxis, however, was not the Aegis. It was a secret, a desperate gambit born of ancient lore and ultimate sacrifice. Deep within the core of a hollowed-out moon orbiting the system's gas giant was a piece of archaeotech, a relic from the dark age of technology so potent and so dangerous it was spoken of only in whispers in the highest echelons of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was called the Solar Lamp. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a stellar manipulation device, a machine capable of focusing and accelerating a star's natural solar flare activity into a single cohesive beam of energy. It could, in theory, be pushed beyond its design limits. It could be used not to create a flare, but to trigger a premature supernova, to force a star to violently detonate. This was the Adamant Warden's final desperate plan. To lure the Gortide into the optimal position between the twin suns and then use the solar lance to turn Praxis Minor into a weapon of unimaginable power, engulfing the demonic fleet in its stellar death throes. The risks were astronomical. The resulting supernova would scour every planet and moon in the system, annihilating the very worlds the Adamant Wardens were sworn to protect. It was an act of supreme self-destruction, a final "I am still here" roared in defiance of the void. It was a plan worthy of a son of Dorn. The command and control for the Solar Lance was a heavily fortified orbital fortress, the Heliopolis, positioned in a stable orbit around the white dwarf Praxis Minor. It was this fortress that the Gortide now targeted. They knew, through their own dark sorceries, that this station was the key. Pajagathrax himself, incandescent with the energies of the ritual, would lead the assault. He would not allow another failure, another delay. The central point of the rune must be completed flawlessly. A wave of daemons, a crimson tide of bloodletters, furies, and daemon engines was hurled at the Heliopolises. The station's defenses were formidable. Hundreds of automated turrets and batteries of vortex missiles tore into the attacking swarm, creating a sphere of pure destruction around the fortress. But the daemons were relentless, their numbers seemingly infinite. To counter the assault, Chapter Master Valerius enacted his part of the gambit. He led a teleport strike with the entirety of his chapter's first company, the veteran Terminators of the Adamant Guard. They materialized in a flash of cerulean light on the outer hull of the Heliopolises, a line of gray and gold ceramite against the screaming chaos. Their storm bolters chattered, spitting explosive shells that shredded the winged furies. Their power fists and thunderhammers crushed the skulls of bloodletters, who managed to gain a foothold on the station's hull. Valerius himself was a bulwark of calm in the storm, his relic blade, stone wraths, cleaving daemons in two with precise, economical strokes. They were buying time. Inside the fortress, a small team of tech marines and mechanicus adepts were frantically making the final preparations, bypassing the safety protocols and pushing the Solar Lance's reactor into the red. This was the desperate gambit. The adamant wardens were the anvil, holding the line, sacrificing themselves to keep the enemy fixed in place. The Solar Lance was the hammer, a blow that would shatter everything, themselves included, to achieve victory. Valerius knew he would not survive. His entire chapter, his ancestral home, the people he was sworn to protect, all would be consumed in the coming fire. It was a price he was willing to pay. He watched as the Gortide fleet, confident in its overwhelming power, moved deeper into the system, positioning itself to lend its full might to the assault on the Heliopolises. They were moving exactly where he wanted them to be, into the kill zone between the two suns. The Vox crackled in his helmet. "Chapter Master," came the voice of his chief tech marine. "The lance is primed. We are 5 minutes from catastrophic overload. The Emperor protects." "No," Valerius replied, his voice devoid of all emotion as he parried the blow of a charging blood crusher and shattered its horned skull with his storm bolter. "Today we protect the Emperor." He looked up from the chaos of the battle on the station's hull and saw it. A shape of impossible size detaching from the throne of wrath. A being of iron and shadow, with vast blackened wings and a crown of obsidian horns, hurtling towards the Heliopolises like a vengeful comet. It was Kajagathrax, the Gore Shepherd, coming to personally oversee the battle. Valerius knew then that his own end would not come from the fire of a dying star, but from the edge of a demonic axe. The high-risk, high-reward plan was in its final critical moments, and the fate of the entire system now rested on a clash between a mortal warden and a demonic god. Kajagathrax descended upon the Heliopolises, not like a warrior, but like a natural disaster. His landing was an impact that sent a seismic shock, shuddering through the entire orbital fortress. 100-meter section of the outer hull buckled and tore, the vacuum greedily sucking debris and the bodies of lesser daemons into the void. He rose to his full, towering height amidst the crater of his own making. World Ender held loosely in one hand, its edge humming a low, hungry dirge. The chaotic, swirling melee of daemons and terminators seemed to freeze for a single, terrifying heartbeat. The lesser daemons prostrated themselves, their rage momentarily eclipsed by pure, instinctual awe. The adamant wardens of the First Company felt a cold dread seep through their conditioned resolve, a primal fear that had nothing to do with training or courage. This was not merely a powerful enemy. It was a fundamental force of the universe, the living embodiment of the concept of murder. Chapter Master Valerius stood his ground. He was a statue of gray and gold ceramite, his feet planted on the shuddering deck, his blade held in a ready stance. He felt the immense, suffocating pressure of the Gore Shepherd's aura, a psychic weight that sought to crush his will, to turn his disciplined resolve into frothing, mindless rage. He met the Bloodthirster's burning gaze, and in that moment, the swirling battle around them became irrelevant, a mere backdrop to the clash of two diametrically opposed wills. On one side, the Warden, the epitome of order, duty, and self-sacrifice. On the other, the Daemon, the avatar of chaos, rage, and slaughter for its own sake. "You have chosen a fine tomb, mortal." Kajagathrax's voice boomed, not through the void, but directly into the minds of every space marine on the hull. It was the sound of mountains grinding to dust. "Your skull will be the centerpiece of my tribute to the Lord of Slaughter when this star dies." Valerius did not answer with words. He answered with action. Raising his storm bolter, he fired a sustained burst at the greater daemon's chest. The mass-reactive shells, each capable of blowing apart a lesser creature, detonated against Kajagathrax's iron-hard hide in harmless puffs of fire and smoke, barely scratching the ancient brass of his cornate iconography. The gesture was one of pure defiance, a refusal to be intimidated, a statement that even a god could be targeted. With a contemptuous snarl, Kajagathrax charged. He did not run. He simply closed the distance between them in an instant, a blur of motion that defied his immense size. World Ender swung in a vast horizontal arc, moving with the speed of a striking serpent, aimed to cleave the chapter master in half. Valerius, his preternatural reflexes pushed to their absolute limit, did not try to parry. He knew his relic blade would shatter against such a blow. Instead, he dropped, letting the colossal axe head whistle over him with a sound like a tearing hurricane. The weapon's passage was so powerful that the displaced air and warp energy shredded two Terminators who stood behind him, their armor peeling away from their bodies like fruit from a rind. Valerius came up from his crouch, lunging forward, inside the Daemon's guard. He thrust Stone Wrath with all the power of his augmented muscles, aiming for the creature's thigh. The power field of his blade shrieked as it made contact, carving a deep, smoking furrow in the Bloodthirster's leg. It was a grievous wound that would have crippled any other being, but Kajagathrax merely grunted, more in annoyance than in pain. He backhanded Valerius with his free hand, a casual blow that carried the force of a siege ram. The chapter master was thrown across the hull, his Terminator armor groaning in protest, every internal sensor flashing red with impact warnings. He slammed into the armored housing of a defense turret, the structure buckling around him. He pushed himself to his feet, tasting blood. His helmet's auto senses were flickering. One optical display shattered. The battle raged around them. His Terminators, his brothers of the Adamant Guard, were selling their lives dearly. They formed a fighting retreat towards the primary command spire, a circle of defiance against the endless tide of bloodletters and blood crushers, buying precious seconds for the solar lance to achieve its terminal overload. They knew their purpose was not to win, but to die in the right place at the right time. The countdown timer, a small, stark rune on Valerius's remaining display, showed 2 minutes. Kajagathrax stalked towards him, dragging his wounded leg, leaving a trail of smoking, black ichor on the deck. "You have the strength of your crumbling fortress, mortal," the daemon roared, resolute, brittle, and destined to fall. He raised his axe again, this time for a crushing overhead blow. Valerius knew he could not dodge again. He met the charge. He brought Stone Wrath up in a two-handed block, pouring every ounce of his will, his faith in the Emperor, and the power of his armor into the parry. The impact was an explosion of energy. The air cracked. Stone Wrath, a blade that had tasted the blood of orc warbosses and chaos lords for 10 millennia, shattered into 1,000 pieces of incandescent light. The force of the blow threw Valerius to his knees, his arms numb, his armor fractured and sparking. World Ender, its momentum barely checked, slammed into the deck plating, cleaving a 20-meter-long chasm in the station's hull. Kajagathrax loomed over the kneeling space marine, a triumphant, bestial grin on his face. He savored the moment, the sight of the broken champion of order. Your hope is broken. Your god is a corpse. Your duty is to die. He raised his axe for the final killing blow. "My duty," Valerius snarled, his voice a broken rasp through his helmet's vox, "is to warden this place." With his last reserve of strength, he slammed his gauntlet, the Hand of Adamant, onto a large, rune-covered emergency panel on the deck beside him. It was the manual override for the final activation sequence of the Solar Lance. It was a dead man's switch, designed for this exact desperate moment. A klaxon, deep and soul-shaking, blared from within the Heliopolises. A beam of pure, blinding white energy, visible even in the light of 2 suns, erupted from the station's core. It was not a weapon firing at the Gortide, but a lance of pure stellar poison plunging into the heart of Praxis Minor. Kajagathrax froze, his axe held high. His demonic senses felt the shift, a fundamental change in the fabric of the system. He turned his head and saw the white dwarf star begin to convulse, its placid, white surface roiled, swelling, its color shifting to a hellish, brilliant blue. The star was dying, and it was going to take the entire system with it. The Gore Shepherd had been tricked. He let out a roar of pure, frustrated rage, a sound that was not of victory, but of being denied the perfect kill. He brought his axe down, not in a killing blow, but in a final, spiteful act of destruction, obliterating the kneeling form of Chapter Master Valerius and the control panel he had activated. But it was too late. The chain reaction was irreversible. The Warden's final duty was done. The death of Praxis Minor was not an explosion in the way mortals understood it. It was a release, an exhalation of divine cosmic violence that transcended sound and fury. The white dwarf, poisoned by the Solar Lance, shed its billion-year-old stability in a single, silent, terrible instant. It swelled, its color shifting from incandescent blue to a purer, soul-searing white that bleached all other light from the system. Then it detonated. A wave of hard radiation and gamma rays, the star's literal death scream, erupted outwards at the speed of light, an invisible tsunami of pure annihilation. For the crew of the Argent Bulwark's picket ships watching from the edge of the system, the event was a paradox of the senses. Their Auspex screens went white with pure, undifferentiated energy readings an instant before the visual reality reached them. Then they saw it. The smaller sun blossomed, a flower of impossible fire growing to engulf the orbit of the system's inner planets. It was a sight of such terrible, sublime beauty that several bridge officers wept, their minds unable to reconcile the sheer magnificence of the spectacle with the unimaginable destruction it represented. For the Blood-Sworn Crusade, caught in the heart of the system, there was no beauty, there was only the end. The wave of pure radiation struck the Gortide fleet first. Geller fields, designed to repel the horrors of the warp, offered no protection against the fundamental forces of the Materium unleashed on such a scale. The radiation washed over the daemonic vessels, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the very bonds that held their impossible forms together began to fail. Hulls of brass and bone, forged in the Imperium, began to sublimate, their physical forms dissolving not into fire, but back into the raw chaos stuff from which they were made. Lesser daemons aboard the ships shrieked as their corporeal bodies were unmade, their essences violently cast back into the warp in a tide of agony. Then came the fire. The expanding shell of the supernova, a wall of stellar plasma burning at millions of degrees, slammed into the fleet. The smaller slaughter cruisers and escort vessels were simply erased, their forms vanishing in the incandescent tide as if they had never existed. The larger fortress ships, like the Skull Cleaver and the Throne of Wrath, endured for a few seconds longer, their immense size and supernatural resilience offering a brief, futile defiance. They glowed cherry red, then white hot, their spires of bone melting like wax, their brass fortifications running like water before they too were consumed, their demonic machine spirits roaring a final unheard curse. Kajaga Thrax, standing on the melting deck of the Heliopolises, was engulfed in the heart of the cataclysm. He did not burn, he did not dissolve. As a being of pure conceptual rage, he was anathema to the cold physics of the star's death. He threw his head back and roared, a challenge to the dying god of a star. The fire washed over him, peeling away his physical form, but his essence, his immortal and unquenchable fury, endured. He was forcibly banished, his being hurled back into the realm of Khorne in an explosion of pure rage and psychic agony, the taste of a victory stolen from his grasp, a bitter ash in his soul. The supernova's wrath was not confined to the demonic fleet. It consumed everything. The Heliopolis vanished in the first microsecond of the blast. The Aegis of Praxis, the proud orbital fortress of the Adamant Wardens, was scoured from existence, its kilometers of adamantium vaporized. The inhabited world it had guarded and the gas giant beyond were stripped of their atmospheres, their surfaces flash-boiled and rendered down to molten slag. The expanding shockwave struck the system's other sun, Praxis Major, warping its gravitational field and sending colossal continent-sized flares of its own, erupting into the void. The Praxis system, once a graceful celestial dance, had become a chaotic stellar hell, and caught in the outer edge of this devastation was the splinter fleet of the traitor, Kyrus the Eight-Bladed. Having finally broken the stalemate on St. Praxilla's fall through sheer bloody attrition, he had been en route to rejoin the main crusade, his ships laden with the skulls of martyred saints and his ego swollen with his perceived triumph. The supernova's shockwave caught his fleet by surprise. It was the attenuated outermost edge of the blast, but it was still the fury of a dying star. His smaller vessels were torn apart by the gravitational shear, while the shields of his flagship, the Razor Storm Bastion, flickered and died. The ship was sent tumbling, crippled and powerless, its crew of Daemons decimated. Kyrus himself survived, but his legion was shattered, his arrogance incinerated in the face of a power he had not accounted for. From the bridge of the stalwart Fury, deep behind enemy lines, Lord Admiral Vance and his ghost fleet saw the psychic flare of the star's death. It was a beacon of pure, righteous fury that momentarily lit up the warp. Every Imperial soul in the fleet felt a surge of grim elation. They had won. An impossible victory had been snatched from the jaws of annihilation. The heart of the Blood-Sworn Crusade had been torn out. A third of its fleet, including its command structure, scoured from existence. The cost was a star system and a noble chapter of Space Marines, but in the brutal calculus of the Sashabirst Millennium, it was a price worth paying. The Imperium had claimed a victory, but as the initial flare of the supernova faded and the psychic senses of the fleet's astropaths recovered, a new and horrifying realization dawned. The death of Praxis Minor was not just a physical event, it had been a sacrifice, a blood offering on a cosmic scale. In his dying act, Chapter Master Valerius had not just destroyed the daemonic fleet, he had perfectly fulfilled their ritual. The violent, agonizing death of the star, witnessed by the unblinking gaze of the blood god, was the ultimate offering. The energy released did not dissipate into the void. It was captured, anchored, and channeled by the partially completed rune that was etched across the galactic arm. On the hololithic map aboard the Fist of Righteousness, the pulsing red icon of Praxis did not go out. Instead, it flared with a new, malignant intensity, the lines of the rune connecting it to the other dead systems, once faint traceries of warp energy, now blazed with the power of a murdered star. The Imperial victory was a sham. They had not prevented the ritual, they had become the instrument of its most critical success. The Blood-Sworn Crusade was battered, leaderless, and fractured, but the grand working, the Crimson Prophecy itself, was now empowered beyond anything the Daemons had ever dreamed possible. The Imperium had won the battle, but in doing so, they may have just lost the war for the soul of the entire sector. A ruined star now sat at the heart of a wound in reality, a monument to a Pyrrhic victory that had served only to feed the eternal thirst of a laughing, bloodthirsty god. The immediate aftermath of the Praxis supernova was a deafening, echoing silence. The cataclysmic energies of the star's death had created a storm in the Materium of such violence that all warp travel and astropathic communication within a dozen light-years became impossible. For a time, the veiled arm was cut off, an isolated pocket of reality shrouded in the psychic fallout of a cosmic murder. When the storm finally began to subside, the picture that emerged was one of absolute chaos and fractured fronts. The Blood-Sworn Crusade was shattered. It was no longer a cohesive, unified force of destruction, but a collection of broken, enraged fragments. With Kajaga Thrax and the core of the command structure banished back to the warp, a violent and bloody power struggle erupted among the surviving daemonic leaders. Angrath, the Unbound, his vanguard fleet heavily damaged but largely intact as it had been at the forefront of the Praxis assault, immediately declared himself the new Gore Shepherd. He argued that the crusade must continue, that the final strokes of the rune must be completed to honor the blood god. His authority was instantly challenged by Umbrakar the Skulltaker, who, having reaped immense glory on Keist, now saw an opportunity for ultimate ascension. He claimed that the ritual was already a success, empowered beyond their wildest ambitions by the star's death, and that their wisest course was to withdraw, to consolidate their power and revel in the glory they had already won. Their disagreement was not one of debate, but of open, brutal warfare. Their two fleets, the largest surviving remnants of the Gore Tide, turned upon each other in the void of the now blighted Keist system. Brass scorpions and daemon engines tore at each other with the same fury they had once reserved for the Imperium. Boarding parties of bloodletters materialized on the bridges of rival vessels, and the corridors of the slaughter cruisers ran slick with demonic ichor. It was a civil war born of pure rage and ambition, a perfect microcosm of the great game, now being played out in the cold vacuum of real space. The grand, unified purpose of the crusade was lost, replaced by 100 smaller internecine conflicts as lesser heralds and champions threw their allegiance behind one of the two mighty bloodthirsters. Hyrus the Eight-Bladed, his fleet crippled and his pride shattered, was a rogue element in this new equation. Humiliated by his defeat at the hands of a dying star, he refused to bend the knee to either Angrath or Umbrakar. He became a Reaver, a pirate king of a damned fleet, his legion of the Eightfold Slice now dedicated to wanton, chaotic destruction. He abandoned the ritual's path entirely, carving a random swath of terror through nearby systems, attacking targets of opportunity not for strategic gain, but simply to vent his boundless, frustrated rage and to gather enough skulls to, perhaps one day, appease the wrath of Khorne for his failure. On the Imperial side, the chaos was just as profound. The Argent Bulwark, which had held its defensive line at Orthax, was now faced with an impossible strategic decision. The single, monolithic threat of the Gore Tide had dissolved into a multi-headed hydra. There were now 3 major demonic fleets, plus dozens of smaller warbands, roaming the Veiled Arm. Lord High Admiral Vance, his ghost fleet battered but victorious after their harrowing journey through the warp, returned to the main body of the bulwark. He was hailed as a hero, the savior of Praxis, but he felt only the cold, bitter weight of the truth. Their victory had been a catastrophic mistake. His war council was divided. Chapter Master Darius Argentius, a creature of cold logic, argued for a systematic, cautious advance. He proposed that the bulwark should move to contain the largest of the splinter fleets, that of Angrath, and methodically cleanse the corrupted systems, one by one, re-establishing Imperial order. Chapter Master Zrukal of the Star Phantoms, however, advocated for a decapitation strike. His fatalistic worldview saw only one solution: to hunt down and destroy the rival Bloodthirsters, believing that without their godlike leaders, the remaining demonic forces would collapse into infighting and eventually consume themselves. Lord Admiral Vance, weary beyond his years, saw the flaws in both plans. To advance cautiously was to give the Daemons time to consolidate, to allow the spreading corruption of reality to take deeper root. To attempt a series of decapitation strikes was to risk overextending their forces, allowing one of the other splinter fleets to strike at their vulnerable rear or at key Imperial worlds now left undefended. The great unified front of the Imperium had shattered just as surely as the demonic one. Their grand strategy was obsolete, and now they were forced into a reactive, desperate war on multiple fronts, their mighty fleet forced to split into smaller battle groups to counter the scattered threats. The entire Veiled Arm became a labyrinth of confusing fronts and bloody, isolated conflicts. A battle group of Silver Skull's cruisers would engage Kyrus's reavers over a desolate moon, while 1,000 light-years away, Star Phantom boarding parties would be fighting a desperate battle in the bowels of one of Umbrakhar's soul forges. The grand, epic war for the fate of a galactic arm had devolved into 100 brutal, pointless skirmishes. The clear lines of battle had been erased, replaced by a chaotic, swirling melee where victory in one engagement meant nothing in the wider context of the war. This was the true, insidious victory of the Crusade. It had not conquered the Veiled Arm, it had transformed it. It had dragged this pocket of the Materium down into its own state of being, a state of endless, meaningless, grinding war, where every faction was broken, every army bled, and every victory was just a prelude to the next slaughter. The front had not just been shattered, it had ceased to exist, replaced by a reality of pure, perpetual conflict. The partial completion of the Great Rune, supercharged by the death agonies of the Praxis Star, did not sit idle in the cosmos. It began to resonate. It was not a sound that could be heard or a light that could be seen, but a deep, foundational hum that vibrated in the very bones of reality. The Veiled Arm was no longer merely a battlefield. It was becoming an extension of the realm of Khorne itself, a semi-permanent echo of his domain, impressed upon the long-suffering flesh of the Materium. The laws of causality began to fray, replaced by the simpler, more brutal logic of the blade. On the agri-world of New Ceres, a planet far from any of the active warfronts, the first sign was the sky. It did not turn red with blood, but the color seemed to drain from it, leaving a metallic, brassy sheen that cast the endless golden wheat fields in a sickly, harsh light. Then came the whispers. Farmers, tilling the soil their families had worked for generations, would hear them on the wind. At first, they were faint, easily dismissed as the rustling of the crops, but they grew louder, clearer, coalescing from a murmur into a single, insistent chant. 8 words, repeated over and over. Blood for the blood, God. Skulls for the skull throne. The whispers bred paranoia, then rage. Old grudges between farming collectives flared into open violence. Disputes over water rights that had been settled by tribunals for centuries were now being settled with harvesting scythes and heavy-duty autotiller. The Planetary Defense Force, sent to quell the unrest, found itself infected by the same ambient fury. A disagreement between 2 squads over firing lanes erupted into a full-scale firefight, and within a day, the entire regiment had dissolved into a dozen warring factions, each fighting and dying for reasons they could no longer remember. New Ceres was consuming itself, its bountiful harvests rotting in the fields as its populace engaged in a planet-wide orgy of self-destruction, a spontaneous and fervent act of worship to a god they did not know they served. This phenomenon, the slaughter's echo, repeated itself on world after world. Industrial planets saw their factories retooled from producing goods to producing crude, brutal weapons of war. Feudal worlds saw their delicate codes of chivalry abandoned for savage, honorless butchery. Even void stations, isolated communities floating in the dark, were not immune. Their inhabitants, driven mad by the incessant psychic pulse of the rune, would turn on each other with maintenance tools and bare hands until the corridors ran silent and slick with blood. The Imperium's war effort was crippled by this new insidious threat. How could the Argent Bulwark fight an enemy that was not a fleet but an idea? How could the Astra Militarum conquer a world that had already defeated itself from within? For every demonic warband they managed to contain or destroy, 3 more worlds would fall to this creeping madness. The war was no longer just against the fractured remnants of the Blood-Sworn Crusade, but against the very nature of the sector itself. For the Daemons, this new reality was a paradise. The thinning veil and the constant simmering rage of the mortal populations acted as a perpetual power source. A bloodletter, once a transient entity needing a constant supply of warp energy to remain in the Materium, could now persist almost indefinitely, drawing strength from the hatred of a nearby hive gang turf war or the fury of a planetary governor executing his own staff. The daemonic civil war between Angrath and Umbracar did not diminish. It thrived in this new environment. Their battles became more ferocious, more spectacular, fueled by the ambient rage of the entire galactic arm. They were no longer invaders in a foreign dimension. They were predators in a new, blood-soaked ecosystem that was perfectly tailored to their existence. The whispers of a new war began to circulate, not among the Imperial commanders, but among the Daemons themselves. As Ingrath's legions clashed with those of Umbracar in the burning skies above a self-immolating fortress world, a new possibility began to form in the minds of the Khornate heralds. The Crimson Prophecy had spoken of making the Materium bleed eternally, a grand tribute to Khorne. They had achieved that. But what if it was only the beginning? What if the rune was not the end, but the means to an end? The theory, whispered in the din of battle and inscribed in blood on the brass walls of their flagships, was terrifyingly simple. The rune was a wound, but it was also a channel. It was a conduit through which the raw power of the realm of chaos was pouring into the Materium. If the slaughter could be maintained, if the echo could be amplified, if every soul in the Veiled Arm could be turned to the worship of the blood god, whether they knew it or not, then perhaps the channel could be widened. Perhaps the wound could be torn open completely. This was the new war they whispered of. Not a war of conquest, but of apotheosis. They dreamed of a final ultimate battle, a slaughter of 8 billion skulls, that would generate enough psychic force to collapse the distinction between realms entirely. They dreamed of dragging the entire Veiled Arm, screaming and bleeding, into the realm of brass and blood, making it a permanent physical extension of Khorne's domain. The Blood-Sworn Crusade's initial goal had been to create a tribute. The new, unspoken goal was to create an empire, not of planets, but of reality itself. This was a war that the Imperium could not possibly comprehend, let alone win. While they fought desperately to reclaim their lost territory, the true battle was for the laws of physics, and it was a battle that was already all but over. The slaughter's echo was not just the aftermath of the old war, it was the opening chorus of a new one. A war whose victory condition was the damnation of existence itself. In the realm of brass and blood, there is no time, only the echoes of great deeds and the thirst for new ones. Khorne, his physical form immolated in the heart of a dying star, his essence hurled back before the skull throne, did not experience defeat. He experienced purification. He stood, reforged in the incandescent rage of his god, before the eternal, silent judgment of Khorne. He had failed to complete the rune. He had allowed his command to be fractured by betrayal and his strategy to be undone by mortal desperation. He expected annihilation, to have his essence unmade and scattered as a warning to all who would displease the Lord of Battle. But Khorne was not displeased. The tribute of a star's violent death, the utter, unforeseen agony of its end, had been a magnificent offering. The panicked, desperate sacrifice of the Adamant Wardens was a skull of such exquisite quality that it now occupied a place of honor at the foot of the throne. The ritual was incomplete, yet its partial success had transformed an entire galactic arm into a perpetual abattoir, a self-sustaining engine of slaughter that would feed the blood god's thirst for millennia. Khorne had not failed. He had succeeded in a way he could not have possibly intended. His punishment and his reward were one and the same. He was to be given a second chance. He was to return to the Materium, not as a conqueror, but as a consolidator, a scourger. His task was no longer to carve the rune, but to stoke the flames of the eternal war his crusade had ignited. He was to be the master of the slaughter's echo, the unifying hand that would guide the fractured demonic legions and the maddened mortal populations toward the true final purpose, the great apotheosis. Kajagathrak's return to the Veiled Arm was not a subtle one. He did not emerge from a warp rift. Reality itself bent and broke around his rage. On the penal world of Damnation's End, a desolate rock orbiting a dying red giant, the sky split open. It was a world of little strategic value, populated by the deregs of the Imperium murderers, heretics, and political prisoners. It had been untouched by the main war, a forgotten backwater. It was for this very reason that Umbrakar the Skulltaker had chosen it as the site for his final confrontation with Angrath the Unbound. The two Bloodthirsters and their rival fleets met in the skies above the planet, their demonic civil war about to reach its bloody crescendo. As their flagships prepared to exchange broadsides, Kajagathrax appeared between them. He was a figure of incandescent, white-hot rage, his form larger and more terrible than before, his hide scarred with the memory of stellar fire. In his grip was not just Worldender, but a new weapon, a great whip forged from the solidified death scream of Praxis Minor. He cracked the whip once, and the sound of its passage was the shriek of 1,000,000,000 dying souls. The psychic backlash slammed into both fleets, silencing their guns and staggering the Daemons on their deck. Umbrakar and Angrath, locked in their own bloody feud, turned their attention to this impossible apparition. They saw not their former commander, but the living will of Khorne himself. There was no challenge, no argument. They prostrated themselves, their personal ambitions incinerated in the face of this divine mandate. The demonic civil war was over. Kajagathrax's command was simple and brutal. The final stroke of the rune, the one they had neglected, was to be completed, but its purpose was no longer to channel power, but to be a final, declarative statement, a signature on their masterpiece of damnation. The target was Damnation's End, not because it was important, but precisely because it was not. Its annihilation would be an act of pure, contemptuous slaughter, a demonstration that even the most worthless of skulls would be claimed for the throne. The reunited Gore-Tide, a single, terrifying entity, once more, turned its full, horrifying might upon the penal world below. The slaughter was not a battle, it was a scouring. The prisoners and their guards, already driven half-mad by the slaughter's echo, offered little resistance. They were simply harvested, their blood watering the barren soil, their skulls piled into mountains that mirrored the landscapes of Khorne's own realm. But the Imperium was not entirely blind. Lord High Admiral Hestor Vance, his ghost fleet, now serving as the Argent Bulwark's far-ranging eyes and ears, had detected the sudden, impossible unification of the demonic forces and their convergence on this single, insignificant system. He did not understand the why, but he understood the threat. A reunited Gore-Tide was a danger the fractured Imperial forces could not hope to face. Gathering his last reserves, the most battle-hardened and fastest ships of the Bulwark, a mere 24 vessels led by his new flagship, the indomitable Wilhy made a desperate final warp jump. He arrived at the edge of the Damnation's End system, to a scene of methodical, planetary butchery. The Gore-Tide was a wall of brass and death, its guns silent, as the legions on the surface completed their bloody work. Vance knew he could not win. His small fleet was a gnat against a behemoth, but he could make a statement of his own. He could deliver one last defiant blow. All hands. His voice rang out across the vox of his small fleet, calm and resolute in the face of certain death. Prepare for the final sanction. We have lived as servants of the Emperor. We will die as his avenging angels, for the Imperium, for Terra. His orders were not to engage, but to charge. It was to be a final, glorious suicide run, aimed at the heart of the demonic fleet, at the newly manifested form of Kajagathrax himself, whose immense presence burned like a baleful star. The indomitable will and its escorts accelerated, their engines burning with final righteous fury. They plunged headlong into the heart of the Gore-Tide. The demonic fleet, caught by surprise by the sheer suicidal audacity of the attack, was slow to react. Vance's ships weathered a storm of fire, their void shields flaring and dying, their hulls breached and venting atmosphere. But they did not stop. The indomitable will, a wounded, burning comet of adamantium, slammed into the throne of wrath. The impact was a silent, world-shattering event. The two colossal vessels, one a masterpiece of Imperial engineering, the other a fortress of pure hatred, tore each other apart. The flagship's plasma reactor, deliberately overloaded, went critical. The resulting explosion was a new miniature star in the sky above Damnation's End, a blast that consumed not only the two flagships, but a dozen other demonic cruisers in its cleansing fire. The penal world below, caught in the blast wave, cracked like an egg, its crust shattering, and its molten core spilling into the void. The final stroke of the rune was complete, but it had been made not by a daemon's hand, but by a mortal's sacrifice. In the aftermath of the final suicidal charge of Admiral Vance, a profound and terrible quiet descended upon the Veiled Arm. The penal world of Damnation's End was gone, shattered into a cloud of radioactive dust and frozen rock. The Throne of Wrath, the heart of the Gore-Tide, was a mangled wreck, its demonic spirit howling in its death throes. Kaa Jagathrax, caught in the heart of the plasma detonation, was not destroyed, but he was once again unhoused. His physical form scoured away, his essence violently banished back to the foot of the Skull Throne. The cost of completing the final stroke had been the decapitation of the Crusade for a second time. With the Gore Shepherd gone and their flagship destroyed, the newly unified demonic host fractured once more. But this time, it was not into warring factions, but into something more akin to a dispersing mist. Their grand purpose fulfilled, their divine mandate completed, the great legions dissolved, the surviving Bloodthirsters and heralds led their warbands away from the core of the Veiled Arm, seeking new, less contested battlefields in other sectors, their holds laden with skulls and their thirst for glory momentarily slaked. The Blood-Sworn Crusade, as a cohesive military entity, had ceased to exist. It had been, in its own terrible way, annihilated. The Imperium, what was left of it in the sector, claimed victory. Lord High Admiral Heston Vance was posthumously declared a hero of the Imperium, his final sacrifice lauded as the blow that broke the back of the greatest demonic incursion the Segmentum had ever seen. The Argent Bulwark, its command structure now transferred to a council led by Darius Argentius of the Silver Skulls, began the slow, arduous process of what they called the Reclamation. They moved from system to system, finding worlds silenced not by demonic invasion, but by their own hand. They found planets littered with the corpses of self-slaughtered populations and broken warbands of daemons squabbling over the scraps. The Astartes cleansed these remnants with cold, methodical fury, their bolters bringing a final, merciful silence to worlds already dead. But it was a hollow victory, a lie they told themselves to ward off the encroaching despair. The rune was complete. Etched across the star charts of the Veiled Arm was a colossal, 8-pointed symbol of Khorne, drawn in the negative space of dead stars and the lingering psychic agony of murdered worlds. The Crusade was gone, but its work remained. The legacy of their war was not in conquered territory, but in a fundamental alteration of reality. The Veiled Arm was now a permanent wound in the galaxy. The slaughter's echo did not fade with the departure of the Daemons. It had become the new background radiation of the sector. The whispers on the wind remained. The latent, simmering rage in the hearts of men was now a permanent condition. Recolonization efforts failed catastrophically. New settlers, brought in to rebuild the fallen worlds, would inevitably succumb to the same homicidal madness as their predecessors. Imperial Guard regiments assigned to garrison duties would have to be rotated out every few months, lest the oppressive, rage-filled atmosphere drive them to mutiny and internecine warfare. The Veiled Arm had become a place where peace was a physical impossibility. War, endless and grinding, was now the fundamental law of existence, as basic and inescapable as gravity. The Imperium had not lost the territory, but they had inherited a hell. The sector became a quarantine zone, a cosmic sore that the rest of the Segmentum tried to ignore. It was a place where Imperial Guard regiments were sent as punishment, a dumping ground for the disgraced and the unstable. It became a self-sustaining meat grinder, the maddened populations and the demoralized garrisons locked in a perpetual cycle of violence that served only to feed the very god who had cursed them. The legend born from this war was a dual-faced one. To the wider Imperium, it was the story of the glorious Blood-Sworn Crusade's defeat, a testament to the indomitable will of humanity. But to those within the Veiled Arm, and to the Daemons who laughed in the warp, it was the story of the Crusade's ultimate, undeniable success. They had not set out to conquer, but to transform, and they had succeeded beyond their most fervent dreams. Kajagathrax, standing once more before his eternal master, was not punished. He was elevated. He had etched Khorne's name into the fabric of reality, creating a masterpiece of eternal slaughter. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in a subtle but profound way. A corner of the Materium now belonged, in spirit and in truth, to the realm of chaos. It was a legacy of ash and blood, a permanent weeping wound that served as a constant reminder of the day the stars themselves were made to bleed, and a chilling prophecy of a day when the rest of the galaxy might follow. The war was over, but the slaughter was eternal.